Deputy, I'll call on Deputy Seamus Healy.
And I welcome the opportunity to speak on this bill, the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Bill 2015. It's an extremely important bill, and it's one that's long overdue. Climate change is a real and distressing phenomenon which disproportionately affects those most vulnerable in our society. We only have to think of countries like the Philippines and more recently Vanuatu, another Pacific island, to see the utter devastation climate change is wreaking on the most vulnerable people in the world, those already living in extreme poverty. Here at home, the Irish Climate Analysis and Research Unit has studied the key meteorological changes in Ireland since 1890, when records began, to 2004, and the results do not bode well. The main finding was that Ireland's climate is warming, and this warming is accompanied by greater rainfall events of higher intensity and frequency and increased flooding. There are very many communities right around Ireland already at the forefront of this struggle with climate change. And particularly in the whole area of flooding, and we've had significant evidence of that in this country, and particularly in my own constituency of South Tipperary, Clonmel, Carrick-on-Suir, Kilsheal, Narfin, Knocklofty, Old Bridge area of Clonmel, all have seen devastation in the past by flooding. Robust, meaningful and action-orientated legislation is vitally important to protect the lives and livelihoods of those living in vulnerable areas. Currently, we have no plan for climate change in this country. In fact, this particular bill we have in front of us is the seventh such bill that has been presented to the Dáil over the past 10 years. And the passing of this bill, with amendments, of course, would mark the very first time that climate legislation has been placed on the statute books in this country. The Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Bill 2015 provides for the preparation of 5-yearly national low carbon transition and mitigation plans, which will set out how Ireland's national greenhouse gas emissions are to be reduced in line with both existing EU and international commitments. This is intended to be done in a dual manner of both mitigation and adaptation. While the introduction of any climate legislation is an encouraging step, this particular bill, in my view, needs to be amended and strengthened. As we know, sending draft bills to Oireachtas committees for consideration was one of the government's main much talked about reforms in the programme for government. And indeed, my colleague Catherine Murphy was a member of the All-Party Joint Committee which scrutinised this bill and made some 12 recommendations. It is disappointing that only 3 out of these recommendations from this committee had been acted upon. And of course it begs the question as to whether Oireachtas committees are taken seriously by the government at all. Effectively, the bill has changed little from the draft prepared by Minister Kelly's predecessor in Environment, Deputy Phil Hogan, whose decision not to include any specific targets for emissions reductions was widely criticised by environmental groups and opposition parties. On this point, I recently attended a briefing by the group called Stop Climate Chaos, a coalition of some of the most eminent civil society organisations in Ireland, including Trócaire, Comhlamh Concern, the National Youth Council of Ireland, to name but a few. And together they constitute the largest network of organisations campaigning for action on climate change in Ireland, and they have described this bill as deeply disappointing. They have identified 5 major weaknesses which need to be strengthened in the bill, and I would concur with those and ask that the amendments necessary be brought forward during the course of the bill going through the Houses of the Oireachtas. The first one would be that the bill fails to set numeric targets for emissions reductions for the future, and this is a fundamental flaw in the bill, as it means there is little concrete direction for the coming years. Civil society organisations are not alone in calling for clear targets. Businesses too also point to the need for a target to provide confidence and drive investment. Finland, Denmark and France have recently announced the introduction of climate and energy legislation, each setting clear targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Finland's law sets an 80% target for 2050, while the Danish law sets 40% for 2020, double the EU 2020 target. France's energy transition bill seeks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 and by 75% by 2050. Given the resistance of some interest groups to a single national target, the compromise proposed by the Oireachtas Committee is to define what is meant by low carbon, which would at least provide some clarity on the objectives of the bill. Minister Hogan set out a definition during his appearance before the Joint Committee in July 2013, and the committee recommended that this be incorporated into the bill. The government redefined the definition and formally adopted it as national policy in April 2014, but it was not included in the heads of the bill. And as a consequence, while some departments like agriculture have been referring to it, others such as transport have been ignoring it. And only putting the definition in the bill will ensure that all departments give it due consideration. The bill proposes also the establishment of the National Expert Advisory Council on Climate Change. And that is tasked with giving advice to government on climate change matters. The Joint Committee again recommended that the Climate Change Advisory Council be modelled on the Fiscal Advisory Council, in that its independence should be prescribed in the bill and its members should be independent of the state or stakeholder interests. Instead, the bill provides for a body of no more than 11 members, 4 of whom represent state bodies in ex officio capacity. The bill does not specify that the Council must be independent in the exercise of its functions, as is the case for the Fiscal Advisory Council. While the bill provides for the Advisory Council to publish its reports, the time period is anything from 30 to 90 days, which is too long a period for the purposes of public debate and transparency. In relation to climate justice, in relation to climate justice, the bill does not provide for the inclusion of climate justice at all, and Ireland has a responsibility to the poorest people in developing countries who are already feeling the impacts of climate change, a crisis they played no part in creating. The climate bill is about mapping out a strong and sustainable future for Ireland. It is also about ensuring that Ireland lives up to its global responsibilities. The government has repeatedly stated its commitment to climate justice as a principle guiding its engagement with climate change. Provision for the principle of climate justice in the legislation provides an opportunity to realise this. In relation to timing, Ireland's last 5-year action plan on climate change expired at the end of 2012, just as our EU 2020 targets came into force. The heads of the bill, published in April of 2014, envisaged that the first national mitigation plan would be adopted within 12 months of enactment of the legislation. This bill now provides a period of up to 24 months for the adoption of the mitigation plan. That would mean that Ireland's plan for reducing emissions for the period 2013 to 2020 would not be adopted until 2017, which is patently absurd. Given the fact that the preparation of the National Mitigation Plan has been progressing in parallel to the development of the legislation, which is long overdue, it is recommended that the period allowed should be 6 months, and that the National Mitigation Plan be finalised and adopted before the UN Climate Summit in Paris in December of this year. The previous 5-year action plan, the National Climate Change Strategy, covered the Kyoto commitment period of 2008 to 2012, and it made clear that the measures contained in it were designed to meet Ireland's Kyoto commitment of limiting total emissions in the period covered to 314 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. All future 5-year action plans should equally indicate the total projected national emissions in the period covered under the plan. And given the significant potential already recognised for climate mitigation by management of the carbon in Irish soils, particularly in wetlands, the bill should include soil carbon management in the considerations to be taken into account in the National Mitigation Plan. One of the purposes of the bill is to provide a platform for as much cross-party and indeed independent support for climate action as possible, given the scale of the transformation needed in coming decades to contain climate change. I welcome the bill, Ceann Comhairle, but would strongly urge that the government would amend the bill during the course of its passage through the Oireachtas, particularly to deal with the 5 points that I've mentioned. And I believe that these would strengthen the bill and strengthen our commitment to climate change and to climate justice. For Margaret.